Greetings and various assorted salutations, and welcome to the second lecture for our World War II unit, Early Aggressions of World War II, or what I like to consider the second part of the fascism lecture. What we'll be looking at here is we'll be looking at how the groups like the Germans and the Japanese used their totalitarian governments to expand and threaten the peace that followed World War I. Well, we like to think of it as peace, but there were actually various revolutions, civil wars, and conflicts going on between World War I and World War II. However, it was peace for those in places like America, Great Britain, and in France. But right off the bat, you might notice that there's kind of a mismatch of terms that you need to fill out versus the terms that are covered in this lesson. So the assignment and what's up on the screen may not quite match. And that has to do with the fact that sometimes what's covered in the lecture and what your assignment is looking at, the assignment might have you look at in more detail. And so you may have to do some reading in the textbook, but that's often how learning works. You take a number of different things from different sources, and you combine them together to build up your body of knowledge. No. There's two terms I want to make particular note of, and that is totalitarianism and fascism. These are very important terms that will come up again and again. Totalitarianism in this unit and the next unit, and fascism is going to be the big one in this unit. Especially when we're talking about the histories of places outside of America and how they impact U.S. history. Rolling on through. Do recall you can pause the video at any time if you need to read a slide more carefully, and also my slides and the scripts to these presentations will be available in the description below in the YouTube video. Now, each of the fascist nations, there's the Nazis, the Germans, the Italians under Benito Mussolini, and the Japanese Empire, each of these asserted that their nation required more. They needed more resources, they needed more land for their people. Each of them considered themselves master races. For example, Mussolini saw Italy as the successor to the Roman Empire and sought to make the Mediterranean Italy's lake. One of the examples of Italian expansion, Italian aggression, is the invasion of Ethiopia in 1935. Here's a chart that kind of shows some of the aggressions. I believe it's found in your textbook, this chart. But the Germans, the Italians, and the Japanese all sought to expand. Speaking more on the German Nazi example, the Nazis sought something called Lebensraum, which is translated as living room or living space. If you are a student of German, you know that that isn't actually the word for living room. And so you can think of this more as kind of living space, living room. The Nazis felt that these lands that they were expanding into contained important farmland resources necessary for protecting their master race. But we're going to take a look at one particular example, the Sudetenland. And essentially, the Sudetenland is an area of Czechoslovakia. So if you're wondering where that is, Czechoslovakia is right here. And where that is particularly, the Sudetenland is this more orangish area. And this is lands that contain many German-speaking people, and according to the Aryans, the Nazis, people of pure German descent. And the Nazis argued that all Germans of pure heritage should live under one flag, citizens of one grand nation, a German nation, under their control. And further, that this should be done by any means necessary, including declaration of war if it should be the most convenient way. Now, while it was true that there were a number of German speakers and people identified with German heritage there, it's also worth noting that the Sudetenland is also the economic center of much of Czechoslovakia's heavy industry. So there was a financial gain in addition to this cultural gain, according to the Nazis. But most people emphasize the Germans under the German flag argument and kind of miss the economics of Czechoslovakia in the mess. Anyways, under such aggressive logic, this was also how the Germans picked up the small, fractured, German-speaking nation of Austria, which was brought in under what was called the Anschluss. Americans, you actually have a very basic outline of kind of the going-ons behind this in the musical The Sound of Music. But in any case, the initial goal of the Nazis was to get all German-speaking countries under the German flag, because they were in different places. There were some Germans in Czechoslovakia. There were German-speaking people in Austria. And the Nazis wanted all of these people under their control for the intent of, well, creating this empire. But let's see if we can get this to scroll. An earlier example would also be like when German troops marched on the Rhineland. The Rhineland is kind of near France, and it's also a very important industrial area, key to a German military. But now scroll down a bit. Now, the League of Nations was an organization tasked with promoting world peace, diplomacy, and human decency, and it failed. With little power and divided opinions, the world's gathering World Court with the League of Nations was really unable to deter any of these totalitarian powers from taking whatever they pleased. In fact, the World Court, the League of Nations, was really directed heavily by Britain and France under a peace policy called appeasement. Essentially, as Germany lusted for land, Britain and France allowed them to take other countries. Britain decided, in fact, that the Nazis could have the industrial region of the Sudetenland. Sure, it was part of Czechoslovakia, but there were a lot of Germans there. And, they spoke German there, and they should be maybe part of Germany if it'll avoid a war. Of course, Czechoslovakia was not included in this decision process. And as a result, the League of Nations basically allowed the dismantling of Czechoslovakia without Czechoslovakia's consent. Now, that is to say, not every British person approved of these decisions. As Winston Churchill would point out and argue, the policy that France and Britain pursued against aggressive nations during the 1930s is known as appeasement. It is a policy of granting concessions to a potential enemy in hopes that peace can be maintained. Unfortunately, appeasement only spurred fascist leaders to become more bold, more adventurous, and aggressive. I believe another analogy he used is it's like sticking your head in a lion's mouth and asking it not to eat you. Something to that effect. And he was right in this regard, and he was right in his opposition, because Germany was never satisfied with what was given to them. Giving them land only made them want more. After the Sudetenland, they wanted Poland. And then why not Central Europe and all of Eastern Europe? Aryans could be moved into these locales, and the locals could be removed. Whether that meant having them killed, sent to detention centers, deported, or enslaved to make that Lebensraum. And so appeasement was not a successful policy, and many people knew it as expressed by this political cartoon. In fact, to really try and get things stopped, we have the Munich Pact, which was made in hopes that Germany would stop with the Sudetenland. Now, while I've been bashing appeasement, let's talk about why appeasement was such a popular political ideology. And that is to think back to World War I. British and French governments of the 1930s had one goal: to avoid war. The Great War killed some 20 million people. If you go to Europe, almost every single town, city, and village has a memorial for their losses in World War I. For many Europeans alive in the 1930s, they felt like they were survivors on top of a pile of corpses. And this scene was quite vivid for anyone who walked down the streets of London, Berlin, Vienna, St. Petersburg, Paris, pick a city in Europe. But you would find in the streets the wounded and broken, some 20 million, actually probably higher than that, who survived this war with injuries. Many of them were homeless or in dire straits, unable to find work even under better times, much less during the Great Depression. Every English boy and girl knew a father, an uncle, or a brother, or somebody who perished, or in some cases they returned a different person due to shell shock. World War I really redefined people's vision of the world for many people. For example, it redefined some people's visions of what hell looked like. Instead of more classical Christian scene, many would see it as a vision of no man's land. The French countryside rendered a barren wasteland due to poisonous gas, barbed wire, rotting flesh, and machine gun nests. As someone may have once said, there is a difference between hell and no man's land, because at least in hell there's no innocent suffering. So then perhaps it's worth looking at the Sudetenland incident in this light. In an effort to appease Germany, Britain's Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain, developed the appeasement agreement called the Munich Pact. We mentioned this vaguely a bit earlier, but the Munich Pact is one of those ideas that comes up a lot in tests. I feel like I'm not being very subtle here. Basically, Hitler could have Western Czechoslovakia, the Sudetenland, if the Nazis agreed to quit taking more lands. In this light of preventing another world war, many might see the Munich Pact, and as this newspaper kind of points out, as the peace in our time, an effort, a crisis averted. Of course, in hindsight, the Munich Pact seems, utterly ridiculous. Germany violated the Treaty of Versailles multiple times at this point. It was common knowledge the German army was expanding beyond the limits of World War I peace. With the Nazis marching into Rhineland, that's another violation. And, of course, the reason the Rhineland was seized was because this was an industrial center. It was something you might want to control if you were, getting ready for a world war or global conquest. In 1938, as stated before, the Nazis took Austria. And we see it now after the war, but Germany had a plan for all of Europe. And the goal of the early seizures of land, the Sudetenland, Austria, these lands, the goal was to stack as much of the deck as possible in Nazi favor before fighting could formally and finally break out. Alrighty, let's move on to Asia. Now, we give a lot of special notice to Europe in World War II because of our interests with fascism and totalitarianism. However, Japan's moves towards an aggressive expansionism is, actually a bit older. We'll talk more about the Japanese in the fourth lecture of this unit, but there's a few things I want to cover here in this particular lecture. Basically, Japan's goal is to build a grand empire in the Pacific. During World War I, they helped the Allies seize a number of German colonies, like in this map here. They helped a lot with this and seizing over here as well, this bay right here in China. However, Japan was mostly ignored by the Treaty of Versailles, and many of these lands were redistributed to the British or the French, and the Japanese never really forgave them for that. As a result, Japan really decided to start striking its own path. Particularly starting in the 1930s, their government took up a more militaristic and aggressive stance towards the rest of Asia. In fact, before World War II, one of the biggest assertive actions that took place was the Manchuria incident of 1931. Essentially, Japanese troops invaded northeastern China, called Manchuria, in 1931. What happens there is they crush Chinese opposition, they crush the Manchurians, and they install a puppet government called the Manchukuo government 6 months later. Now, this puppet government was touted as an official Chinese Manchurian country. However, the people in charge of the Manchukuo government they only answered to the Japanese, and it was essentially a Japanese territory with some Chinese loyal to the Japanese in charge of management of it. Now, obviously, the League of Nations did not approve of this invasion, but Japan really didn't care. The Empire of Japan would actually withdraw from the League of Nations in 1933, and the League of Nations really didn't have any consequences for that action. And so, at this point, the League of Nations was not being taken very seriously, especially by the Japanese. And here's where Manchuria is more or less located, is in northern China, modern-day China. But there's some pictures of that event, of the occupation army marching in. The image quality could be better, but no. Now, the Japanese caused quite a stir in China, and this actually triggered a war in China because the Japanese decided to invade the rest of China. And as a result, the Japanese would often accidentally attack various neutral factions operating in China, such as Europeans and the Americans. So there was often attacks on neutral powers in a not-so-subtle effort to basically take over all of China in the name of building a grand Japanese empire. Now, the Japanese diplomatic corps would label these as accidents. Given the sheer number of accidents, and the fact that the Japanese diplomatic corps had a habit of covering up for the military, well, let's take a look at an example, such as the 1937 sinking of the U.S. Peine. This is the most infamous incident. Essentially, the U.S. Peine was a gunboat on the Yangtze River. The Yangtze River is, of course, located right here. And essentially, the mission of the USS Peine was to protect American interests and American civilians operating in China. It happened that the Japanese were attacking Chinese forces in that area. The Japanese Navy deployed 12 aircraft, and they proceeded to attack every ship in the area, including 3 civilian vessels, which Standard Oil Company barges, a couple of British gunboats, the HMS Ladybird and HMS B, and they sunk the American ship, the USS Peine. The diplomatic mess after this is quite confusing and convoluted. Let me scroll down to get you the whole picture. But basically, according to the United States, according to the U.S. personnel in that area, they had clearly identified the day before and had clearly marked their ships as American ships. The British had also said that they clearly marked their stuff as British ships, and that they were targeted anyways. The Japanese diplomatic corps stated that the Japanese military had not seen or heard any indication of the ship's owners, and it assumed they were Chinese-controlled, and that's why they attacked them. However, the Japanese, trying to be diplomatic, said it was an accident. They took responsibility for this. And, well, the United States would kind of ultimately overlook this issue because the United States really didn't want to get into a land war in China, and we really didn't want to get into a naval war with the Japanese, and so it was largely overlooked by the United States diplomatically. Now, this perhaps leads us to a rather important question for U.S. history and a U.S. history class is, where is the United States in all of these messes, whether they're in Europe or Asia? And where that comes, where the U.S. is we practiced isolationism. America looked on from a safe distance. Large oceans framed the U.S. borders, the Atlantic and the Pacific. And America's greatest concern, especially in the 1930s, was commerce. U.S. troops abroad, like the U.S. Asiatic Fleet, they were just efforts to ensure that we had some presence to protect our business interests, like massive corporations like Standard Oil and Dole Fruits, well, they had a different name back then, and our few colonial holdings like the Philippines and Hawaii. And so we just didn't have a lot of resources out in those areas. And part of this stems from the mentality after the Great War. No battles were fought on American soil during the Great War. And while the United States had fought briefly in the war and helped set up the League of Nations, our people grew very tired of the bickering of European powers, and we were just disinterested with the going-ons of that distant Asian continent. We really had really different concerns. We had our own problems at home. The Great Depression, that thing called the Dust Bowl blotting out the sun in some parts of America, those were the problems in our backyard, and many Americans didn't want to deal with those. So isolation is going to be the key term that comes up a lot in this unit, and then we're going to kind of effectively drop it for the rest of U.S. History 3. So essentially it means a policy of remaining apart from affairs of other groups, especially political affairs of other countries. That doesn't mean we weren't interested in making money. No. So to kind of give you an idea of some of these policies, in fact, the United States was actually planning on reducing our colonial holdings. The Philippines, a property we picked up in the Spanish-American War, for example, was scheduled to be given independence in 12 years with the Tidings-McDuffie Act, passed in 1934. It stated that the U.S. would give the Philippines their independence peacefully. To give you an example of American isolationism, we also have the Neutrality Acts of 1935 and 1936, which these banned the loaning of money and sales of weapons to countries at war, often referred to as belligerents if you're looking in the textbook and places. As a result, this meant that many Americans could also not enter war zones. They couldn't do business with these places. And one of the impacts of this is that the United States was effectively completely out of the Spanish Civil War, which was a major event going on. Essentially what happened is Spain's more democratic government would be overthrown, collapse, due to the violent rise of Francisco Franco, a fascist who was supported by Nazis and Italian fascists like Benito Mussolini. So that kind of kept U.S. economic and political interests out of that conflict, and allowed fascism to expand into Spain. However, there was kind of a problem with this neutrality. This don't sell to people on either side of a war was problematic. It really cut into corporate profits, and the United States really depended on foreign countries, peaceful and not, to have a stable economy. We needed places to sell our goods. And so the real big change that we'll go through is something called the Cash and Carry Excluding Arms of 1937. This lifted this lifted a lot of the restrictions and allowed American companies to sell anything but weapons to these countries. And essentially the rule of cash and carry was you had to pay for the items before you shipped them in your own ships. Well, that's the basic idea of that. But to keep in mind America's isolationist policies of the 1930s, the United States' goal was to avoid getting dragged into a foreign conflict, but still make money at the same time. But to kind of wrap up this lecture, of course, we in the distant future know that appeasements fail. This unit is called World War II after all. Little did those in the 1930s realize that a war was going to break out, something far more horrifying than anything they could have imagined. World War II is nightmarish in scope, and as we will see, it is far, far worse than what the appeasements thought they were avoiding. We'll also see America, the United States of America, come out of this dark age a different nation. A lot of the isolationist stuff we're talking about now, they're going to disappear as we get more and more involved in World War II. And when we get to the next unit, isolationism is a historical term. But no. So next time we'll start World War II, a war that is greater in terms of death and destruction than the so-called Great War. I guess until later.